In the foundational years of the Third Reich, between 1933 and 1939, a potent and pervasive myth was meticulously crafted and disseminated throughout Germany, the absolute invulnerability of its skies. This narrative of aerial supremacy was not merely a product of abstract propaganda but was anchored in the colossal ego and bombastic assurances of one man, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. As the appointed commander-in-chief of the newly formed Luftwaffe, Göring positioned himself and his air force as the ultimate guarantors of national security, promising the German people a future free from the terror of aerial bombardment. This period was defined by his public declarations, which transformed the city of Berlin, in the minds of its citizens, from a national capital into an unbreachable fortress. The Luftwaffe, officially established in 1935, was Göring's personal project and the centerpiece of his power. He oversaw its rapid development into a force that, at the time, genuinely possessed a significant technological advantage. Its squadrons were equipped with modern Messerschmitt Me-109 fighters and the infamous Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, supported by a coordinated air defense system. Göring presented this formidable military machine not just as a tool of war, but as an impenetrable shield. He publicly boasted that any enemy foolish enough to challenge German airspace would be met with shameful defeat and annihilation. This message was amplified by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry, which tirelessly repeated the mantra that not a single stone in Berlin will be shaken by an explosion, instilling a profound sense of safety and unwavering faith in the Reich's might among the populace. The pinnacle of this hubris came in August 1939, on the very eve of the war. In a now infamous display of arrogance, Göring made a sweeping promise that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the capital of the Reich. He solidified this guarantee with an even more audacious declaration concerning Germany's industrial heartland: no enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr. If one reaches it, my name is not Hermann Göring, you can call me Meyer. This Meyer quote would come to haunt him, becoming a symbol of the chasm between his grandiose promises and the brutal reality that was to come. Beneath the surface of this state-sanctioned confidence, however, lay a more complex reality. The myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility was significantly inflated by its performance during the German intervention in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. The Condor Legion's successes against the Spanish Republicans, who lacked a modern air force, provided a skewed and dangerously flattering assessment of its true capabilities. It was a victory in a contest that hardly tested the Luftwaffe's limits. Within the Nazi hierarchy, rumors circulated that Hitler himself had absolute faith in Göring's promises, so much so that he would have initially dismissed any report of a bombing raid on the capital as an impossibility. Yet, not everyone was convinced. Some seasoned generals within the Wehrmacht harbored private skepticism about Göring's grandiose claims, but in the political climate of the Third Reich, no one dared to publicly challenge the Reichsmarschall. Years later, during his interrogation in June 1945, a defeated Göring would attempt to reframe his legendary boast. When confronted with his pledge, he defensively clarified, "I only said that I would do everything in my power to ensure that not a single bomb fell on Berlin. Besides, that was said when we had complete air superiority." This post-war rationalization stood in stark contrast to the absolute certainty he had projected before the conflict. It was a tacit admission that his promise was not a statement of fact, but a gamble made on a supremacy that would prove to be tragically finite. By 1939, the myth was fully formed, the stage was set, and the German people, reassured by the words of their Reichsmarschall, slept under the illusion of an inviolable sky. The myth of Berlin's invulnerability, so carefully constructed by propaganda and Göring's bombastic rhetoric, did not endure for long. The first tangible crack in this armor appeared on the night of June 7, 1940, in a daring but modest operation. A single French Farman F.223 bomber penetrated German airspace and successfully dropped its payload on the southwestern outskirts of the city. While the raid caused no casualties and negligible material damage, its psychological impact was profound. For the first time, a physical act had contradicted the Reichsmarschall's guarantees. The unbreachable fortress had been breached, proving that the capital was, in fact, vulnerable. This initial pinprick was soon followed by a more significant assault. On the night of August 26, 1940, the British Royal Air Force launched the first serious bombing raid against Berlin. A fleet of 81 aircraft was dispatched, though the immense distance and navigational challenges meant that only 29 bombers reached their target. a loss rate of 25%. These planes dropped 22 tons of bombs on the northwestern sector of the city. The physical results were still relatively minor by later standards, but they were no longer symbolic. 12 people were killed, and 1,800 buildings were reported as destroyed. By the end of 1940, the cumulative toll from these early raids had risen to approximately 200 fatalities and a similar number of destroyed structures. The figures were modest, but the undeniable fact remained: Berlin was burning. The city's air defenses, commanded by the 1st Flak Division, were formidable on paper, consisting of some 500 anti-aircraft batteries. However, in practice, their coordination was insufficient to form an impenetrable barrier. The British light bombers, primarily Vickers Wellingtons and Handley Page Hamptons, were pushed to the absolute limits of their operational range to even reach Berlin. They relied on the cover of darkness and the frequent winter clouds and fog of northern Europe to evade German day fighters, though this did little to protect them from the relentless anti-aircraft fire. It was during this period, in late 1940, that the first German radar stations began to appear, representing the nascent stages of a more technologically advanced system for controlling the airspace. Despite the evidence, the Nazi leadership remained publicly defiant. Göring, secure in his belief in the Luftwaffe's overall superiority, dismissed these raids as little more than annoying incidents, refusing to acknowledge them as a sign of a serious or escalating threat. Propaganda Minister Goebbels worked tirelessly to control the narrative, using state-controlled press and radio to minimize the significance of the bombings. They were officially characterized as desperate and futile terror attempts by a failing enemy, doomed to have no impact on German morale or war production. For the citizens of Berlin, the night of August 26, 1940, was a jarring introduction to a new reality. As air raid sirens wailed across the capital for the first time during a British attack, people hurried to shelters, filled with a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. The raid was not the apocalyptic storm they might have feared, and in its aftermath, many residents returned to a sense of normalcy, viewing the attack as mere enemy chirping that the mighty Luftwaffe would easily silence. No one could yet imagine that these first tremors were but a prelude to the devastating firestorm that would one day engulf their city. This was only the beginning. Just as the Nazi leadership was beginning to dismiss the sporadic Western raids as manageable nuisances, a far more shocking and symbolically devastating blow was delivered from the one direction it was considered impossible. In July 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union seemingly progressing on schedule, Hermann Göring had once again reassured Hitler, confidently stating that the Russians would never be able to fly to Berlin. This assertion was not just a promise, it was a core assumption of German military planning. It was shattered on the night of August 8, 1941, in one of the most critical moments in the unraveling of Berlin's myth of invulnerability. In an audacious long-range mission, a group of Soviet naval aviation bombers, DB-3s, officially designated as torpedo bombers, struck the heart of the Third Reich. The special squadron of 15 aircraft, under the command of Colonel Yevgeny Preobrazhensky and his navigator Pavel Koklov, took off from a precarious foothold, Saaremaa Island in the Baltic Sea, the last remaining Soviet-held territory in the region. The journey was a testament to extreme endurance and courage. They flew a one-way distance of 890 kilometers in a straight line, navigating for nearly 7 hours at a punishing altitude of 7 kilometers. The crews battled temperatures plunging to -40 degrees Celsius, causing the cockpit windows to freeze over and forcing them to rely on emergency oxygen supplies. The German defenses were caught in a state of utter disbelief. So convinced were they of their security from an eastern attack that as the Soviet planes flew over the city of Stettin, German air defense crews mistook them for lost Luftwaffe aircraft returning to base. They even switched on searchlights, helpfully signaling for their planes to land at a nearby airfield. The illusion was broken only when the bombs began to fall on the capital itself. During the raid, Soviet radio operator Vasily Krotenko transmitted a message that would become legendary: "My location is Berlin. The task is complete. Returning to base." This simple broadcast sent shockwaves of panic through the Nazi leadership. Of the initial 15 aircraft in Preobrazhensky's group, only 5 managed to reach and bomb Berlin directly, the others targeted secondary objectives like Stettin and Kolberg. Across a series of subsequent raids, a total of 31 sorties were made against the capital, with German sources confirming 32 separate fire outbreaks. In total, 33 Soviet aircraft, representing 38% of the dispatched force, successfully reached Berlin during this campaign, a significant achievement given the extreme risks. The cost was high, 18 planes and 7 crews were lost. The reaction in Germany was one of stunned confusion. The first German radio broadcasts about the attack bewilderedly reported that 150 British aircraft had raided Berlin, unable to comprehend or admit that the Soviet Union possessed the capability for such a strike. Göring was reportedly consumed with rage. The raid was not just a military failure but a profound personal humiliation. His promise had not only been broken but publicly ridiculed by an enemy he had deemed technologically inferior. Hitler immediately convened an emergency meeting, demanding an explanation. Cornered, Göring was forced to defend his honor, dismissing the raid as a one-off adventure that will not be repeated. The impact on public morale in Berlin was immediate and severe. The psychological shield had been pierced. If the supposedly primitive Russians could fly to the capital, what was stopping the British from doing so with greater frequency and force? The carefully constructed narrative of Nazi propaganda had suffered an irreparable blow. In total, Soviet aircraft would conduct 8 raids on Berlin between August and September 1941, with the final mission occurring on September 4. Years later, Göring's own testimony would underscore the significance of this event. In a protocol of his interrogation, he was reminded of his July 1941 assurance to Hitler that no Soviet plane could reach Berlin. After the events of August 8, that promise had been exposed as a catastrophic miscalculation. One Luftwaffe officer was rumored to have remarked grimly at the time, "If the Russians can fly to Berlin, then this is the end of our war." In the minds of many, the question had been planted, was this a fluke, or was it the beginning of the end? Following the sharp, psychological shocks of 1941, an eerie and deceptive quiet descended upon Berlin. For a prolonged period spanning late 1941 and the entirety of 1942, the terrifying wail of air raid sirens became a rarity. This newfound peace was quantifiable and deeply reassuring to a populace that had been rattled by the initial British and Soviet attacks. Throughout all of 1941, the city's sirens had sounded a mere 17 times, a number that included the 2 alarming Soviet raids. The following year, 1942, was even quieter, with only 9 alerts recorded across the entire year, just one of which was attributed to a Soviet mission. This lull was not, as propaganda insisted, the result of German invincibility, but rather a reflection of the strategic and technical realities faced by the Allies. The British Royal Air Force had learned a harsh lesson from its early forays to the German capital. Its light bombers were suffering unsustainable losses, with casualty rates sometimes reaching as high as 50% for a single long-distance mission. The heavy, 4-engine bombers like the Avro Lancaster, which would later become the backbone of the bombing campaign, were not yet fully deployed or available in sufficient numbers to mount a sustained offensive against such a heavily defended and distant target. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Air Force was locked in a brutal, existential struggle. The immense pressures of the ground war meant that resources were scarce. Fuel shortages, crew fatigue, and staggering combat losses made long-range strategic bombing missions to Berlin a technical and logistical impossibility for the time being. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, seized upon this quiet period with masterful opportunism. The absence of bombs was presented to the German people as definitive proof of the Luftwaffe's impenetrable shield. Goebbels confidently proclaimed that the enemy had been decisively beaten back, that their air forces had crumbled to dust against the iron wall of the Luftwaffe. Propaganda leaflets echoed this sentiment, boldly declaring, "The enemy is powerless before the might of the German air." This message found a receptive audience. Many residents of Berlin, weary of the war and eager to believe in their own security, began to embrace the myth of invulnerability once more. A peculiar psychological phenomenon took hold. Some citizens became more fearful of the propagandistic stories about potential raids than of the raids themselves, which had become infrequent to the point of being a distant memory. Hermann Göring, ever eager to reclaim his tarnished reputation, positioned this calm as a personal victory. He publicly framed the lack of attacks as the direct result of his leadership and the supposedly enhanced and perfected air defense network protecting the Reich. However, behind this facade of confidence, his credibility was eroding where it mattered most. By 1942, Göring was facing quiet criticism from within the Nazi leadership. His grand pronouncements, once a source of national pride, were now beginning to elicit irony and private scorn even within the highest circles of the Reich. For the people of Berlin, however, it was a comforting lie they desperately wanted to believe. But it was a fragile peace, a fleeting silence that served only to mask the gathering of a terrible and inevitable storm just over the horizon. The deceptive calm of 1942 was shattered as the calendar turned to 1943. This was the year the illusion of safety died, not with a whisper, but with the thunderous roar of hundreds of engines. The entry of the United States Army Air Forces, USAF, into the European theater, coupled with the growing power of Britain's Bomber Command, marked the beginning of a relentless and systematic aerial assault that would reduce Berlin to rubble. The era of sporadic, nuisance raids was over, the era of mass destruction had begun. The onslaught began in earnest on the night of January 16 to 17, 1943, with the first truly large-scale raid on the capital. A force of 190 Lancaster and 11 Halifax bombers pierced the city's defenses, killing 198 people. Even well-organized evacuation procedures were not enough to save everyone. The pace quickened dramatically. On March 1, 257 aircraft targeted the Telefunken factories and railway workshops, leaving 191 civilians dead. Just weeks later, on March 18 to 19, another raid claimed 300 more lives. By the end of that month alone, the civilian death toll had climbed to 1,700. The fall brought no reprieve. A series of 3 raids between September 23 and 24 killed another 1,344 people. The scale of the attacks reached a new peak between November 18 and 27, when a staggering 2,044 bombers pummeled the city in a sustained aerial blitz, killing 4,330 civilians. The year 1944 introduced a new dimension of terror. Massive daylight bombing raids conducted by the American B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers. On March 22, American bombers struck aviation factories in the suburbs of Oranienburg and Basdorf, but the collateral damage was immense, leaving nearly 1.5 million Berliners without shelter. The largest daylight raid of the war occurred on June 21, 1944, when a wave of over 1,000 American bombers darkened the skies, leaving the city engulfed in flames. Behind this overwhelming offensive was the systemic collapse of the Luftwaffe. Göring's Air Force was losing its best, most experienced pilots in a desperate war of attrition. Their replacements were often young, hastily trained recruits from the Hitler Youth, no match for the seasoned Allied air crews. The critical turning point came with the introduction of the American P-51 Mustang, a long-range escort fighter that could accompany the bomber formations all the way to Berlin and back. The Mustangs decimated the German interceptors, effectively gutting the Reich's air defense. The final, apocalyptic phase of the air war came in early 1945. On February 3, a fleet of 950 B-17s, escorted by 785 P-51s, dropped 2,298 tons of bombs on the city center. The flak defenses were all but useless. It is estimated that as many as 25,000 people were killed in that single day. The streets were ablaze, and the subway tunnels, once seen as safe havens, became mass graves when bombs struck ventilation shafts. Just 3 weeks later, on February 26, an even more terrifying raid saw 781 B-17s and 285 B-24s unleash 2,796 tons of explosives with almost no losses to themselves. The degraded German air defense system had ceased to be a meaningful obstacle. By April 1945, the city had absorbed 45,517 tons of bombs from the British and another 23,000 tons from the Americans. The statistics of the destruction were staggering. 55 to 60% of the city was utterly destroyed. 1,250,000 Berliners were left homeless. German data officially recorded 19,400 civilians killed and up to 35,000 wounded. 920 industrial facilities were completely annihilated, with another 1,350 partially damaged. 41,200 residential buildings were completely destroyed, and approximately 207,000 more were damaged. The physical ruin of Berlin was mirrored by the political ruin of its supposed protector. This catastrophic failure was laid squarely at the feet of Hermann Göring. As he would later state at the Nuremberg trials, relations between myself and the Führer were excellent until 1941. During the war, they deteriorated continuously until they reached a complete collapse. That collapse began with the first bombs on Berlin and accelerated with every raid, as his hollow promises were incinerated along with the city he had sworn to protect. As the physical structure of Berlin crumbled under the weight of Allied bombs, so too did the psychological foundation of the Nazi regime, the people's faith in their leaders. The constant terror from the skies fostered a deep and pervasive cynicism that no amount of state propaganda could suppress. In the tense, subterranean world of the air raid shelters, a bitter form of gallows humor took root, becoming the primary outlet for the public's disillusionment and a miniature portrait of the Reich's moral collapse. With their city burning around them, Berliners began to mock the very promises that had once made them feel secure. Jokes became a form of quiet rebellion. One popular anecdote that made the rounds in the shelters was a simple, cutting exchange. A German says, "Göring promised that not a single bomb would fall on Berlin." Another replies, "Yes, but he forgot to say from where they would be falling." The Reichsmarshal himself became a figure of ridicule. His infamous 1939 boast that people could call him Meyer if a bomb ever reached the Ruhr came back to haunt him with a vengeance. Berliners began to derisively refer to Göring as Meyer, a quiet but potent symbol of his broken word and utter failure. Even the youth were not immune. It was rumored that members of the Hitler Youth would quietly sing altered, satirical versions of the celebratory anthems dedicated to the Luftwaffe. The Nazi leadership was acutely aware of this creeping dissent. Goebbels issued strict orders forbidding the spread of defeatist anecdotes and comments, but the secret police could not be everywhere at once. The shared experience of huddling in shelters created a bond of solidarity that superseded fear of the authorities. The propaganda ministry frantically attempted to pivot its messaging. Unable to claim invulnerability any longer, it reframed the Allied raids as barbaric attacks by the enemy on the civilian population. This new narrative, however, failed to take hold. The people of Berlin were not fools. They knew that the raids, however indiscriminate they felt, were targeting factories, railway lines, and government buildings. The lie was too transparent, and it only deepened their distrust. This collapse in morale was not just anecdotal, it was documented. Secret Gestapo reports on public sentiment noted that the spirit of the people was fundamentally broken after 1943. Citizens began to speak openly amongst themselves about the inevitability of defeat. This disillusionment permeated every level of society, even reaching the circles of the military elite. Luftwaffe officers, once the proud vanguard of the Reich, were heard in the privacy of their clubs openly criticizing Göring, calling him a liar and a fraudulent idol. Their wives, in turn, would whisper in beauty salons, "Perhaps our husbands are right when they say the war is lost." The collective sentiment was perhaps best captured in a piece of folk doggerel that emerged from the era: "Göring promised, Göring lied. The Luftwaffe was silent. Berlin burns." For many, the point of no return had come much earlier. As one captured Luftwaffe officer stated during an interrogation, the entire belief system had been shattered from the very beginning of the bombing campaign. "I no longer believe a single word from our leadership." The first raid on Berlin in August 1941 destroyed our entire system of belief. The destruction of Berlin was not just the story of a city's demise, it was the chronicle of a personal and political downfall. Hermann Göring's authority, built on the promise of an invincible Luftwaffe, crumbled in direct proportion to the bombs falling on the capital. His fall from grace was not a single event, but a slow, agonizing process that began with one catastrophic failure and was sealed by another. The first profound blow to Göring's prestige came far from Berlin, in the frozen wasteland of Stalingrad in 1942. When the German Sixth Army was encircled, Göring made a fatal promise to Hitler. He guaranteed that his Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air, initially pledging 500 tons of cargo per day, a figure he later revised down to 300. It was an impossible task. The resulting airlift was a disaster, costing thousands of vital bombers that had been crudely converted into transport planes. After this failure, Hitler's trust was irrevocably broken. He began to openly and frequently accuse Göring of lying, marking the beginning of the end for their once close relationship. The Allied bombing campaigns of 1943 to 1944 were the nails in Göring's political coffin. Each raid on Berlin served as a daily, undeniable testament to his impotence. With every siren, every explosion, and every casualty report, his standing in Hitler's inner circle diminished. He became increasingly isolated from the center of power, a living symbol of broken promises. This long decline culminated in the final, dramatic days in the Führerbunker. On April 22, 1945, with the Red Army closing in, Hitler declared to his staff that his closest confidants had betrayed him. When one of his generals suggested bringing troops from France to defend Berlin, Hitler responded with dripping sarcasm, "Let the Reichsmarschall decide that question." He immediately followed this by confiding in the general that his doubt was justified, "Perhaps the army will not want to fight under Göring's command." The public humiliation was total. A day later, on April 23, Göring sealed his own fate. From his location in Bavaria, he sent a carefully worded telegram to Hitler. Citing a 1941 decree that named him as Hitler's successor, he asked for permission to assume leadership of the Reich. In the paranoid atmosphere of the bunker, and spurred on by Göring's bitter rival Martin Bormann, Hitler interpreted the message as an ultimatum, an act of high treason. His reaction was volcanic. He officially stripped Göring of all his titles and positions, expelled him from the Nazi Party, and ordered his immediate execution. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz was named as his new successor. Soon after, an SS detachment, acting on Bormann's orders, placed Göring under arrest. His humiliation was absolute. As the captive Göring was driven through the apocalyptic ruins of the city he had sworn to protect, one of his guards allegedly taunted him, "Reichsmarschall, where are your bombers now?" Göring remained silent. Even after the war, during his interrogation at Nuremberg in June 1945, he tried to salvage his legacy. When asked about his oath that no bomb would fall on Berlin, he retorted, "That is all enemy propaganda. I only said that I would do everything in my power to ensure that not a single bomb fell on Berlin. Besides, that was said when we had complete air superiority." Yet, in a more candid interview, he admitted the true turning point: "It became clear to me that the war was lost after the Soviet bombing of Berlin in August 1941. Everything else was just a postponement of the inevitable." At the Nuremberg trials, Göring was the most prominent defendant, often dominating the courtroom with his intelligence and defiant demeanor. But it was a hollow performance. In his final statement on August 31, 1946, he declared, "The victor will always be the judge and the vanquished the accused. I do not recognize the decision of this court." Denied the soldier's death he desired, he cheated the hangman's noose, taking his own life with a hidden cyanide capsule the night before his scheduled execution. By the time the final shell fell in May 1945, Berlin was a ghost of its former self, a sprawling testament to the complete and utter failure of the promises made by Hermann Göring and the Nazi regime. The myth of its invulnerability, once a cornerstone of national pride and confidence, lay buried beneath millions of tons of rubble. The final statistics paint a picture of almost unimaginable destruction. Over the course of the war, the city endured a staggering 363 separate air raids. These included 42 massive, concentrated attacks involving 18,600 aircraft, and 147 smaller raids carried out by 7,860 planes. The physical toll was apocalyptic. Between 55% and 60% of the city was obliterated. Out of the 1,502,383 buildings that stood in 1939, only 976,500 remained relatively undamaged. The human cost was equally devastating. At least 1,250,000 Berliners were rendered homeless, becoming refugees in their own country. While official German data listed 19,400 civilians killed, other credible estimates placed the figure as high as 50,000. This carnage unfolded despite the presence of one of the most formidable air defense networks in the world, which by 1943 boasted 500 heavy and 250 light anti-aircraft guns, guided by 55 radar stations. This powerful system proved tragically insufficient. Even as the city burned, the Nazi propaganda machine churned on, insisting until the very end that Berlin remained invulnerable, a claim so divorced from reality that it became a macabre joke. But the psychological damage was far deeper than simple disillusionment. The relentless destruction of the capital was the destruction of a core tenet of Nazi ideology, the myth of the Aryan Superman, and the inherent invincibility of the Third Reich. This myth was not ultimately defeated on the battlefields of Russia or the beaches of Normandy, but in the skies over Germany's own capital, where the failure of the regime was on nightly display for its own citizens to witness. The fall of the Luftwaffe's authority precipitated the collapse of the Nazi regime's authority as a whole. In a final historical irony, many post-war historians have argued that the Allied strategic bombing campaign failed in its primary stated objective of crippling German industrial production, which continued to function at a high level until the final weeks of the war. However, where it succeeded unequivocally was in its moral and psychological objective. It annihilated the German people's belief in victory. The strategic bombing demonstrated to the world, and to the Germans themselves, that in the age of modern aviation, no city and no army could ever consider itself truly invulnerable. As the historian William Shirer noted, the myth of the invulnerability of Berlin was not destroyed in a single day, but over 1,000 nights and days, when the city burned under the waves of enemy planes. This sentiment was echoed from the other side by a Soviet pilot who participated in the audacious raid of August 8, 1941. When I heard that Göring had promised that not a single bomb would fall on Berlin, I thought it was either humor or madness. It turned out that the madness of the Germans was real. The final image of the war was of Berlin in ruins. The craters, the charred skeletons of buildings, and the cellars filled with the dead were the reality. No propaganda could erase it. The myth was dead. Göring was a captive. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist. Only the silent ruins of the city stood as mute witnesses to how the most bombastic promises of the Third Reich had been turned into nothing more than ash and dust.